So, before I even start, I need to clarify something. I'm not one of those thrill seekers looking for a scare or someone into messed up stuff just for kicks. This whole thing, it was all just a sick accident that I'd take back if I could. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I guess curiosity just got the best of me, and it spiraled out of control before I even realized what I was getting into. This started about a month ago. I've always been into tech stuff, and yeah, I've heard about the dark web. It's this shadowy part of the internet people talk about with the usual rumors, illegal markets, strange forums, and even worse things if you dig deep enough. But I never planned to actually get involved in that scene. But there's a difference between hearing about something and seeing it for yourself. I think that's where I messed up. I wanted to see for myself if all the horror stories were true. One night I was messing around on my computer and I came across this forum with people talking about how to access the deepest parts of the dark web. At first I thought it was a bunch of nerds trying to act tough, but some of them started dropping details on how to find these red rooms, the infamous live streams where terrible stuff supposedly happens. I know, it sounds insane. Even typing it now feels like I'm retelling a horror movie plot, but trust me, it's all real. I downloaded the 2R browser, set up my VPN, and followed all the necessary precautions the forum posts talked about. I wasn't going to do anything illegal, I just wanted to see what was out there. The dark web felt more like an urban legend than reality, but soon enough, I found myself staring at pages and pages of disturbing sites. The feeling was like falling down a bottomless pit, and with every click, I was just going further and further. Eventually, I found myself in a chat room that people were calling a gateway to the darkest parts of the dark web. It was full of usernames, some with bizarre symbols, and the chat felt like reading a language of its own. They were talking about a show happening at 3 a.m., and everyone seemed hyped, if you could call it that. I don't know what got into me, but I stayed up and kept reading the messages, feeling this horrible, gnawing curiosity. At some point, someone posted a link. It looked like nonsense code, but with one click I was in.
The site was pitch black, with nothing but a blinking cursor in the middle of the screen. Then, words started appearing. "Welcome to the show. Only the invited may stay." I felt this sick excitement in my gut, the kind that mixes with fear and keeps you glued to the screen. A chat box opened, and I could see other users joining. There was no turning back now, so I waited. A countdown started, and I realized this was it. One of those red rooms I'd read about. The countdown hit 0, and the screen changed. Suddenly, I was watching a grainy live stream. The quality was horrendous, like it was filmed on some old security camera, but you could still make out what was going on. There was a dimly lit room, with a single chair bolted to the floor. The room looked damp, and the walls were a grimy grey, covered in what looked like stains. I tried to convince myself they were just watermarks, but in the pit of my stomach, I knew better. Then, this figure walked into the room, dragging someone else along with them. The person they were dragging was tied up, struggling, and looked terrified out of their mind. They were wearing a hood, so I couldn't see their face, but the fear was obvious. The figure left, and the camera zoomed in on the tied-up person, showing the terror in their body language, the way they trembled even though they couldn't scream. The chat went wild. People were typing things I don't even want to repeat, begging for the show to start. I was horrified, but I couldn't look away. I didn't want to be there, but it was like my body was frozen, glued to the screen. After what felt like hours, but was probably just minutes, the figure returned with a bag of tools. They started pulling things out slowly, almost like they were showing them off. A knife, a hammer, things that looked like old medical tools that had no place in any regular household. And the chat, they loved it. They were begging for specifics, like they wanted to see every single twisted thing this person had planned.
Then suddenly the feed cut. It went black, like the whole site had shut down. The chat went crazy, people freaking out about being cut off mid-show. For a second I thought that was it, that I was off the hook, that I wouldn't have to witness anything else. But the screen flickered back on. Only this time the view was different. The camera had zoomed in, and on the screen, in horrifying, pixelated clarity, was a photograph. It was me. I can't explain the feeling that washed over me when I saw my own face on that screen. It was like everything around me went quiet, like I was suddenly underwater, my heart pounding so hard it drowned out everything else. I thought, there's no way that's me. But it was. The picture was taken recently too. I could tell from the shirt I was wearing, one I'd just thrown on that morning. I wanted to believe it was some kind of messed up prank, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. The picture looked like it was taken from a distance, maybe from across the street. You could barely see my expression, but the angle was unmistakable. It was like someone had been watching me without me even knowing. I stared at it, my hands gripping the edge of my desk so hard my knuckles went white. The chat blew up immediately, people typing messages like, "He's next," "Fresh meat," "Can't wait to see this one," all directed at me. I wanted to close the screen, to shut it down, but I couldn't move, like my body was frozen in place. The site glitched for a second, and another line of text appeared. "You have 24 hours to prepare. We're watching." That was it. The screen went black again, and I was left staring at my own reflection on my monitor. The ghostly after-image of my face still burned into my mind. My head was spinning, trying to process everything. What did they mean? 24 hours? Prepare for what? Were they just messing with me? Or was this real? I couldn't tell anymore. I closed the browser, slammed my laptop shut, and just sat there in the dark, listening to the silence of my apartment. The next 24 hours were a nightmare. I felt like I was being watched, even though I tried to convince myself that it was just paranoia. Every little sound, every creak in the floorboards sent me into a panic. I started to feel like someone was just around the corner, lurking in the shadows. I even checked my door and window locks, but it didn't help.
That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd see that image of myself on the screen, as if it was burned into the inside of my eyelids. I thought about calling the cops, but what would I even tell them? Hey, I was messing around on the dark web and now some psychos posted my picture. Yeah, right. They'd probably laugh me out of the station or worse, lock me up for even being on that part of the internet. The next day, I decided I had to at least try to act normal. I went to work, trying to keep my mind off of everything, but it was impossible. Every time I passed a security camera or glanced out a window, I felt that same creeping sense of dread. I started to notice people looking at me, or at least I thought they were. I was becoming paranoid, seeing shadows where there were none. When I got home that evening, I found something that made my stomach drop. It was a letter, a plain white envelope shoved under my apartment door. My name was scrawled on it in messy, almost childlike handwriting. Hands shaking, I opened it up, feeling my heart race as I unfolded the paper inside. The note read, "We know where you are. We know who you are. 12 hours. That was it. No signature, nothing else. I dropped the note, feeling the weight of it hit me like a punch to the gut. This was real. I didn't know how they found me or why they were targeting me, but I knew now that there was no getting away from it. That night was the worst of my life. I barricaded my door, stacked furniture in front of it like some desperate attempt to keep whoever they were out. I closed every curtain, turned off every light, and sat there in the dark, waiting. Every passing minute felt like an hour. Every creak and groan of my apartment building had me on edge, imagining the worst. Then, sometime in the dead of night, I heard it. 3 knocks on my door, slow and deliberate. I froze, my heart practically stopping. The knocks came again, louder this time, like they were mocking my silence. I wanted to scream, to call for help, but I couldn't make a sound. It was like I was trapped in my own body, unable to do anything but listen. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the knocking stopped. I waited, barely breathing, listening to the silence that followed. I thought maybe, just maybe, they'd given up, that I was safe. But then I heard it, a faint scraping sound, like something metallic being dragged along the floor. It started outside my door, slow and steady, moving closer and closer. That was when I noticed a shadow under the door, a figure standing just on the other side. Whoever it was, they weren't leaving. They were waiting, testing me, seeing if I'd make a move. I stayed there, huddled in the corner, trying to stay as silent as possible. Hours passed, and eventually, I must have fallen asleep out of sheer exhaustion, because when I opened my eyes again, it was morning, and the shadow was gone. But when I went to the door, my heart sank. There, scratched into the wood in jagged letters, was a message: "Tonight." I don't even remember how I got through that day. It felt like my brain was working on autopilot, just trying to keep me alive while my mind reeled from what was happening. My hands shook every time I picked something up, and I couldn't concentrate on anything. I didn't eat, didn't talk to anyone, and barely even left the couch. All I could think about was that word scratched into my door: tonight. I must have checked the clock 1,000 times, watching the hours crawl by, wondering what tonight would bring. Part of me thought about running, about getting as far away from my apartment as possible. But where would I go? If they had my picture, if they'd already been to my door, they'd find me wherever I went. I felt trapped, like an animal in a cage, just waiting for something to come for me. When the sun went down, that familiar dread came flooding back. I tried to stay calm, to tell myself I was just being paranoid, that this was all some sick prank. But my gut told me otherwise. I knew, deep down, that this wasn't a joke. They were out there, watching, waiting for me to make a move. Around midnight, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to know if they were really coming. I turned off every light, grabbed a flashlight, and took a spot by the window, crouched down so no one could see me. My heart pounded as I peered out into the darkness, scanning the empty street below. It was quiet, dead quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I kept expecting to see someone standing there looking up at me. For hours, nothing happened. I started to wonder if maybe they'd given up, if the whole thing was just a sick game meant to scare me. I felt stupid, sitting there in the dark, my knees aching from crouching so long. But just as I was starting to relax, I saw it, movement at the edge of the street. At first, I thought it was just a stray dog, or maybe a random person passing by. But as they came closer, I realized this person was different. They were tall, too tall, with an unnatural, almost stiff way of moving, like their limbs didn't bend right. I couldn't make out their face from the distance, but their head was tilted at an odd angle, and they were wearing something dark, almost blending into the shadows. Then I saw them stop. They turned, slowly, and looked directly up at my window. I dropped to the floor, my heart racing. I knew they couldn't have seen me. I'd been careful, made sure to keep the light off. But somehow, I felt like they knew I was there, like they were staring right through the walls, right into my soul. I stayed frozen on the floor, barely breathing, waiting to see if they'd come closer. A minute passed, then 2, and eventually I worked up the nerve to glance out again. But when I looked, they were gone. Just like that, they'd vanished, leaving me alone with nothing but my fear and the silence. I told myself it was just some random person, that I was seeing things, letting my imagination run wild. But I knew, deep down, that wasn't true. They'd been there, watching, just like the message had said.
The hours crawled by, each one more suffocating than the last. I wanted to scream, to break something, anything to make this nightmare end. I thought about calling a friend, asking someone to come over, but who could I trust with something like this? Who would believe me if I even tried to explain? Around 3 a.m., I started to hear footsteps outside my door, slow, deliberate, like someone was pacing back and forth. My blood ran cold as I realized they were back, right outside my door, testing me, waiting for me to react. The footsteps stopped suddenly, and I heard a soft scratching sound, like someone was dragging their nails down the door. The noise was faint, barely audible, but it felt like it was burrowing right into my skull. I stayed as quiet as I could, clamping a hand over my mouth to keep from making a sound. Then, A voice, a low, distorted whisper, came through the door. "We're closer than you think," it said, the words slurring like they were coming from someone in a trance. "Watching you. Waiting." I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The voice was unlike anything I'd ever heard, hollow and lifeless, like it didn't belong to a real person. It was taunting me, daring me to come closer, to open the door and see what was waiting on the other side. But I didn't move. I just sat there, curled up on the floor, praying they'd go away. After what felt like an eternity, the voice stopped, and the footsteps retreated down the hall, fading into silence. I waited for hours, afraid to even blink, until the first light of dawn finally started to creep through the window. When I finally dared to look, I saw something else that made my blood run cold. Taped to my door, just above the scratch marks, was a photograph. It was me again, but this time it was different. I was asleep in my bed, the image taken from right next to me, close enough that I could see every detail of my face, the way my hair was splayed across the pillow. My stomach twisted as I realized what this meant. They'd been inside my apartment. They'd been in my room, right next to me while I slept, watching me the whole time. And in the corner of the photo, scrawled in that same messy handwriting, was another message. Tomorrow. After seeing that photo, I knew there was no more pretending this wasn't real. I was being hunted, and I was running out of time. I spent the entire day in a state of numb shock, my mind running through every possible escape plan. But nothing felt safe. Nowhere felt far enough. These people, whoever they were, had gotten into my home, crept into my room while I was sleeping, and left without a trace. I called in sick to work, unplugged everything electronic, and turned off my phone, thinking maybe that would stop them from tracking me somehow. But I knew it was a long shot. They had me right where they wanted me, and I could feel it. As night fell, I started to think about my options. Part of me just wanted to bolt, to run as far as I could, get on a bus, and disappear. But there was something terrifyingly certain inside me that they'd find me wherever I went. I was in too deep. They'd made sure of that. By midnight, I couldn't take the silence in my apartment anymore. Every little sound, every shifting shadow, made my skin crawl. My heart was pounding so loud I could barely hear my own thoughts. I knew that tonight was it. Tomorrow. That word from the note kept echoing in my mind, taunting me, like some twisted countdown that was finally running out. At around 2 a.m., I heard it again. The footsteps outside my door, slow and steady. I didn't even bother to look this time. I knew it was them. I knew they were out there waiting. The footsteps stopped and then silence. I sat there, gripping my baseball bat, listening to the quiet. Minutes passed, maybe hours. I lost track of time. My grip on the bat was so tight my hands ached, but I couldn't let go. It was the only thing I had, the only sliver of protection between me and whatever waited beyond that door. Then, the door handle jiggled, just slightly. It was quiet, almost tentative, like someone testing it to see if I'd forgotten to lock it. My whole body went cold. I forced myself to stay silent, barely breathing, praying they'd go away. But then, the door handle twisted harder, turning back and forth, the sound echoing in the silence of my apartment. I felt like my heart was going to explode. I could hear my own pulse in my ears, drowning out everything else. Finally, the handle stopped moving. I thought maybe they'd given up, that they'd leave me alone. But that's when I heard something that made my blood freeze. A key. I heard a faint click, and then the sound of my door unlocking. They'd gotten a key somehow. Maybe they'd copied it. Maybe they'd taken it when I wasn't paying attention. I didn't know, and it didn't matter. All I knew was that they were coming inside. The door creaked open, and I saw a shadow slowly stretching across the floor, long and twisted. I held my breath, praying they wouldn't see me, that somehow I could disappear into the darkness. But they knew I was there. They'd known all along. A figure stepped into my apartment, tall and shrouded in darkness. I couldn't see their face, but I felt their eyes on me, piercing through the shadows. They took a slow, deliberate step toward me, then another, closing the distance between us. I tightened my grip on the bat, my hands shaking, my mind screaming at me to do something, anything. Who are you? I managed to choke out, my voice barely a whisper. But they didn't answer. They just stood there staring, as if they were savoring the moment, enjoying my terror. Finally they spoke, their voice low and distorted, like it was coming from somewhere far away. "You should never have looked," they said. "You opened a door that was never meant for you, and now you belong to us."
I felt a wave of cold terror wash over me, paralyzing me. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. I was trapped, caught like a fly in a web. Then they took something out of their pocket, a small black device like a phone. They held it up, aiming it at me, and a red light blinked on. I recognized it immediately. It was a camera. "You're going to be a star," they said, and I could hear the twisted smile in their voice. "The show's about to start." I lunged forward, swinging the bat with all the strength I had left, desperate to make contact, to hurt them, to get them out of my life. But before I could even react, I felt a sharp, searing pain shoot through my chest. I looked down, and there, sticking out of my side, was a long, thin blade. My vision started to blur, dark spots dancing at the edges. I tried to scream, to fight back, but my body wouldn't listen. I felt myself sinking, collapsing to the floor as the darkness swallowed me up. The last thing I saw was their face leaning over me, their eyes gleaming with a sick satisfaction. And then, everything went black. When I woke up, I was in a small, dimly lit room. The walls were bare, concrete, and the only light came from a single bulb hanging overhead. My head pounded. My body felt like it had been through hell, and I realized I was tied to a chair, my wrists and ankles bound so tightly that I couldn't move. I looked around, panicked, and that's when I saw it. A camera on a tripod, aimed right at me. The red light was blinking, recording. I could hear faint voices somewhere nearby, and I knew I was live. Somewhere out there, in the darkest corners of the internet, people were watching me in the same way I'd watched that other victim just days before. I wanted to scream, to beg for mercy, but I knew it was useless. They were watching, waiting for the show to begin, just like they'd promised. And as the figure stepped into the room, holding that same set of twisted tools, I realized that I'd become just another face on the screen, just another story for the people lurking in the shadows. I was the next victim in the red room. And that's how my story ends, I guess. If you're reading this, don't make the same mistake I did. Don't go looking where you're not supposed to, because once they have your name, once they know your face, there's no escaping. You're already part of the show. I've always been a lurker on the more benign corners of the internet, a silent spectator in forums and social media, never one to poke around the darker recesses that I knew lurked just a few wrong clicks away. That barrier shattered one mundane Wednesday afternoon when I received an unmarked envelope in my mailbox. It was a thick, manila thing that felt hefty in my hands. Inside were several high-resolution photos of me, eating at my favorite cafe, playing with my dog in the park, even sitting on my porch late at night, absorbed in my phone. Each photo was more recent than the last, and the last was taken just a day before. But it was the letter that accompanied these images that chilled me to the core. It was typed with clinical precision, a stark contrast to the chaotic evil it conveyed. The letter began unassumingly enough, recalling mundane details of my everyday life, details no stranger should know. Then it descended into explicit threats, stating that watching me had become their favorite pastime and hinting at a more physical interaction soon. With my hands trembling and a nausea building in the pit of my stomach, I frantically searched my home for any signs of intrusion. Windows intact, doors locked, nothing amiss except for the sinking realization that my privacy had been meticulously violated. I installed security cameras the very next day, a futile attempt to regain some semblance of control. That night, as I reviewed the footage, I caught a glimpse of a figure lingering just beyond the reach of the porch light. Although blurry, the figure's stance suggested a familiarity, an eerie comfort in its own sinister vigil. Sleep became an elusive friend. I jumped at every shadow and startled at the smallest noises, my home no longer a sanctuary, but a glass house exposed to unseen eyes. The police took a report but offered little comfort, drowned in a sea of similar cases and lacking any leads to pursue. Days morphed into a blur of paranoia, with each envelope's arrival deepening my fear. They grew more personal, photos taken from angles that suggested proximity I couldn't fathom without a constant shiver. One pictured me sleeping on my couch, the TV's glow casting ghostly shadows over my face. Another was of my sister and her kids at her home, 2 states away, which crossed a line I hadn't known existed until then. The details in the letters grew more grotesque, describing not just what they saw, but what they wanted to do. The stalker wrote about the texture of my hair, the imagined feel of my skin, and their longing to sample it. They mused on how my sister might scream if she knew how close they'd been to her children. Desperation led me to forums and dark web experts, seeking anyone who might understand this better than the local authorities. My post was a beacon to others like me, and responses poured in, not with solutions but shared experiences, forming a macabre community bound by victimhood. Among the sympathetic messages was one that stood out for its understanding and detail. It was helpful, too helpful, knowing exactly the kind of fear I was experiencing. When I traced the username, it led back to an inactive email account registered under my own secondary email, one I hadn't used in years and only for trivial sign-ups. It dawned on me then how deep this rabbit hole might go, the stalker not just an observer, but an active participant in my frantic search for answers, manipulating my desperation. Nightmares haunted me, ones where I'd wake up not in my bed, but in a dark room, the stalker's silhouette just a breath away. And even in the light of day, I couldn't shake the feeling that every step I took was just further into their trap. As I sit here, typing this, another envelope sits unopened beside me. The weight of the paper feels like the final nail in a coffin that's been meticulously crafted just for me. I know I'll have to open it, but not yet. First, I need to gather what little courage I have left. Tonight, I'll share my story, throw it into the void of the internet, hoping against hope for a lifeline. The envelope remained sealed beside my keyboard, a dreadful totem amidst a sea of panic-stricken notes and online detective work. My thoughts circled like vultures around the same haunting question. How could someone orchestrate such terror with such intimate knowledge of my life? The weight of unseen eyes pressed down on me, stealing the air from my lungs each time I dared to hope for a moment's peace. Days slipped by, each marked by the arrival of a new letter. Despite my initial resolve not to open them, curiosity and fear proved a potent mixture, too strong to resist. Inside this latest one, the stalker escalated their psychological torture. The contents were no longer just photos, but included a detailed list of my daily routines, down to the brand of coffee I drank and the side of the bed I preferred to sleep on. But it was the final item tucked within the envelope that sent me spiraling. A small, crudely fashioned doll, stitched together with what looked like human hair, wearing a tiny shirt, one that belonged to me, snatched from my laundry. Their message was clear. They could reach out and touch my life in the most personal ways. Sleep had long abandoned me, leaving in its place a restless vigil. I scoured the security footage nightly, dissecting shadows and analyzing every frame for a sign of my tormentor. The police had become a fixture at my door, their visits prompted by my frantic calls, each triggered by the slightest rustle of leaves or flicker of a street lamp. Their reassurances felt empty, rendered ineffective against a threat that moved like smoke within and around my life. In my online postings, I shared updates, hoping for a breakthrough from the faceless crowd of sympathizers and fellow victims. Among the voices, one suggested that perhaps the stalker was someone I knew, someone who feigned ignorance while hiding a malevolent grin. This thought sent me spiraling into a trustless frenzy, eyeing friends and family with suspicion, isolating myself further. I decided to delve deeper into the dark web, using guides and tips from the more obscure forums. My screen glowed late into the night as I navigated through digital back alleys, seeking any clue that might reveal who was behind this. It was there, in the darkest corners of a hidden forum, that I found a thread discussing a group known for terrorizing random targets, selected for no reason other than the perverse thrill of the hunt. This discovery prompted me to install more sophisticated security systems around my home, cameras that left no blind spots, microphones sensitive enough to catch a whisper. The data piled up, terabytes of video and audio, all monitored by software designed to flag anomalies. One night, the system pinged an alert while I was hunched over my laptop. My breath hitched as I pulled up the footage. There, captured in grainy night vision, was a figure at the edge of my property. They were not merely passing by, this was a deliberate pause, a silent message that they were watching. As they turned slightly towards the camera, the light caught their face, obscured by a hood and mask. The image was too distorted to make out details, but the intent was unmistakable. That night, I didn't call the police. Instead, I sat in darkness, watching the footage on repeat, trying to glean any recognizable trait, any clue that might lead to their identity. My mind raced, terror mingling with a desperate need to end this nightmare. As dawn approached, my eyes bloodshot and my body trembling with fatigue and fear, I received an email notification. It was from an anonymous address, with a single line that made my heart stop. "Nice security, but I'm closer than you think." The message was sent with a geotag from inside my own home. The realization hit me with the force of a freight train. They had access, not just to my yard, but to the very wires and waves through which I sought safety. The stalker was no longer at my doorstep. They were inside, violating every last shred of my sanctuary. Terror, raw and unyielding, gripped me as I stood and began to systematically search my house, every shadow a potential harbinger of the confrontation to come. With the chilling realization that the stalker was not just near but potentially inside my home, my sanctuary turned into a prison of paranoia. Each corner I turned in my once familiar house now seemed sinister, every creak a potential whisper of the unwanted guest lurking within my own walls.
I spent the morning in a frantic sweep of every room, checking closets, under beds, behind doors, anywhere a person might hide. But it wasn't just the obvious spots. I tapped walls, listened for hollows, searched for any sign of tampering. Everything appeared normal, yet the email's geotag gnawed at my mind, a digital arrow pointing mockingly at my own ignorance of my surroundings. Determined to uncover any hidden breaches, I rented thermal imaging equipment. Walking through the chilly rooms, the device in hand cast an eerie glow, translating the cold world around me into a spectrum of blues and reds. Everything seemed as it should until I reached the basement. The stairs groaned underfoot as I descended, the air growing colder, the shadows deeper. The walls, usually solid in their mundane utility, now revealed a different story, a subtle, almost imperceptible patch of heat behind the water heater. My breath caught as I approached, the hairs on the back of my neck standing in primal warning. The wall here, part of the foundation, should have been cold, unyielding. But as I removed a panel to reveal the inner workings of the house's plumbing, my hand found not pipes or concrete, but a void. Behind the facade was a hollow, an alcove crudely carved into the earth itself, just large enough for someone to crouch, to wait.
Inside this hideaway, I found remnants of human presence, a dirty blanket, water bottles, food wrappers, all fresh, all recent. This wasn't just a stalker. This was an invader who had made my home theirs, observing me from the shadows, sharing my own air, all unseen. Shaken, I called the police again, showing them the hidden nook, the evidence of habitation. Their response was swift this time, a flurry of activity and blue lights, officers and detectives swarming my property. They took samples, dusted for prints, their seriousness a reflection of the horror the hideout inspired. As the investigation unfolded, they installed surveillance, monitored my home network, and stationed a patrol for nightly checks. The sense of being watched had turned tangible, with both the stalker and the protectors omnipresent. Yet despite all this, the envelopes continued to appear. Each was more invasive, more personal. One included a picture of me discovering the hideout, taken from an angle that suggested it was shot from inside the house, possibly from one of the few blind spots I hadn't known existed until then. The next phase of my nightmare began with another email, this one containing a video attachment. With trembling hands, I clicked play. The footage was grainy, shot in low light, but unmistakably it was of me, in my home, my private moments filmed without my knowledge. The camera had lingered on me, on my most vulnerable instance, sleeping, changing, unaware of the watching eye. And then, the voice, distorted but undeniably taunting, broke the silence of the footage. "You can't hide in your own home." This was no longer about being watched or followed. It was an assertion of control, a demonstration of power. They wanted me to know I was never alone, that every moment of perceived solitude was a lie. I responded the only way I felt I had left. I went public. Against the advice of the police, I shared everything on social media, the forums, anywhere people would listen. My story spread, picked up by local news, then national. The outpouring of support was immense, but so was the backlash, the doubters and thrill-seekers, all feeding into the circus my life had become. But the exposure worked in one unexpected way. It drew out others who had suffered similarly, who recognized the methods, the psychological torture. Connections were made, patterns recognized, and from this shared misery, a clearer picture of my stalker began to emerge, pointing to a network rather than a lone predator. They were organized, methodical, and as my case gained visibility, they retreated back into the shadows from which they had so boldly emerged. Yet, the damage was done. I was a shell of my former self, mistrustful and jittery, jumping at shadows and flinching at every email notification. My home felt like a set, a stage for some twisted play in which I was both the star and the victim. And as I prepared for another sleepless night, the dread settled in once more, a constant companion in the darkness. The shift from solitary stalker to an organized network did little to ease my fears. If anything, it magnified them, transforming my ordeal into something far more sinister and widespread. As my story circulated and the pressure from law enforcement increased, my existence became a life under a microscope, each day dissected by detectives, the media, and an ever-growing online community fixated on every development. Despite the ongoing investigation and the semblance of safety provided by police patrols, the communications from the stalker, or now stalkers, did not cease. They became cryptic, their messages encoded with references to places I had been, conversations I had had in supposed privacy, and indirect threats disguised within layers of literary quotes and historical facts, showcasing their intellect and resources. One particularly chilling letter contained a detailed family tree, not just my immediate family, but extending back generations, interspersed with newspaper clippings of long-forgotten tragedies that had befallen my ancestors. The message was implicit yet clear. They had been watching for a long time, perhaps longer than I could comprehend. The stress and constant fear took a physical toll. I lost weight, my face drawn and pale, eyes hollow from sleepless nights spent poring over every new piece of communication, searching for an end to the torment. My home, once a retreat, now felt like a fortress under siege, every delivery or visitor a potential threat. I replaced moments of human interaction with scrutinizing security feeds, obsessively reviewing footage, desperate to spot any anomaly. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. A keen-eyed detective noticed a recurring figure in the background of several public camera feeds, not close enough to be overt, but consistently present in the peripheries of my day-to-day activities. This person was traced back to a known hacker group, one with tendrils extending into various forms of cybercrime, but no known connection to stalking until now. Armed with this new information, the police coordinated a sting operation using me as bait. With meticulous planning, they set up surveillance at a cafe I frequented, one where the figure had been spotted. I was there, wired and under watchful eyes as bait, pretending to enjoy a coffee, my every nerve on edge, while plainclothes officers positioned themselves strategically around the venue. The tension was palpable, the cafe's air thick with the silent intensity of the operation. Then, in a swift flurry of movement, the officers converged on a figure who had just taken a seat at the corner of the bar, a regular yet unremarkable patron by all accounts. The arrest was quiet but decisive, the suspect taken into custody with a stunned expression, caught unaware in the web they had helped weave around me. Interrogation revealed a fraction of the network's complexity. The person was part of a larger syndicate that used stalking as a means to manipulate, extort, and control their targets for various ends: money, influence, and, disturbingly, entertainment. They chose their targets through a twisted game of chance, drawing names from data breaches, their criteria known only to the inner circle of the group. As more arrests were made, a pattern of horrifying clarity emerged. Each member of the group had specific roles: surveillance, hacking, psychological manipulation, each a cog in a well-oiled machine of terror. What they hadn't expected was the resilience of their chosen victim and the communal force of a society that rallied around the tormented. Even with several members in custody, the threat lingered. The network was extensive, their reach long, and the roots of such evil ran deep. Authorities warned me of potential reprisals, suggesting protective measures that ranged from changing my identity to relocating entirely. But fleeing felt like conceding defeat, letting them strip away the very essence of who I was. My home, my life, my identity were not just remnants of my past, but the battleground I was determined to reclaim. I fortified my defenses, both digital and physical, and turned to the community that had supported me through my darkest times. They helped set up secure communication channels, organized shifts for neighborhood watches, and funded upgrades to my home security through crowdfunding efforts. In this newfound solidarity, I found not just safety, but a purpose. I began to speak out about cyberstalking, using my ordeal to educate others, to turn my trauma into a tool for awareness and change. My blog posts, once desperate pleas for help, now became narratives of empowerment, strategies for protection, and a call to action against the faceless crimes that thrived in the shadows of the digital age. Yet, the night still held a tinge of fear, a whisper of danger in its winds. As I lay in bed, listening to the secure locks click and the hum of surveillance cameras, I wondered if the eyes that had once watched me so closely were still out there, waiting for a moment to strike again. The fight had been won, but the war, the eternal vigil against darkness, was ongoing. The network had been fractured, its members scattered by the force of law and the glare of public scrutiny, but the silence that followed was far from peaceful. It was a charged, heavy silence, filled with the echoes of what had been endured and the faint, ever-present dread of what might still lurk unseen. The world knew my story now. My name had become synonymous with both victimhood and resistance. And yet, within that newfound fame, the shadows of anonymity I once craved seemed more a luxury than a mere facet of life. The days turned into weeks, and with each passing moment, the normalcy I attempted to reclaim felt increasingly like a delicate facade. The emails and letters had stopped, the photographs no longer appeared, but the sense of being watched somehow persisted. Perhaps it was the trauma, etched deep into my psyche, or maybe it was the realistic paranoia of knowing the network's reach had been vast, its roots deep and not fully eradicated. I continued to use my platform to advocate for victims of cybercrime, sharing my experiences in blog posts and at speaking engagements. The feedback was overwhelmingly supportive, but it was the private messages from others who had experienced similar horrors that kept the ember of fear alive in my heart. They wrote of shadows disrupted by the slightest light, of lives overturned by anonymous malice, and in their words I saw reflections of my own terror. Despite the measures I had put in place, the security systems and the routines that had become almost ritualistic, there was one night when it all felt as fragile as glass. It was late, the world outside wrapped in the quiet darkness of a waning moon, when my phone buzzed with a notification from my security system. Motion detected at the perimeter. My heart raced as I pulled up the camera feeds, my fingers numb, bracing for the worst. The cameras showed nothing but the swaying of trees in the wind, their branches casting gnarled shadows across the lawn. I reviewed the footage again, frame by frame, until I saw it. Not a person, not the definitive shape of a stalker, but a small, almost imperceptible distortion near the edge of the frame. It was nothing definitive, perhaps just a glitch in the system, but it was enough to send a ripple of panic through me. That night, I didn't sleep. I watched and waited, the remnants of my former siege mentality creeping back. By morning, with no further incidents, I tried to convince myself it had been nothing, a trick of the light or a fault in the system. But the seed of doubt was planted, sprouting roots that clawed quietly into the walls of my resolve. The next day, I received a letter. It wasn't like the others. It was just a plain white envelope, and inside, a single piece of paper with a typed message. The deeper you dig, the darker it gets. Let there be light, but be wary of what it reveals. This cryptic message sent chills down my spine. It was a stark reminder that the tendrils of the network were still out there, perhaps regrouped and lurking in the depths, watching for any sign of vulnerability. It could have been a taunt, a warning, or a mere intimidation tactic, but it reignited the smoldering anxiety that I had worked so hard to extinguish. I responded the only way I knew how, by bolstering my defenses and expanding my outreach. I started a non-profit dedicated to helping victims of cyberstalking, combining resources with other activists to form a robust network designed to offer support and protection where it was most needed. Life had become a constant cycle of vigilance and advocacy, each day a step on the path of a never-ending journey through a landscape forever altered by my ordeal. The echoes of the past reverberated in every step I took forward, a haunting melody that underscored my existence. And in the quiet moments, when the world seemed to pause and the shadows deepened, I found a strange kinship with the darkness. It had been my enemy, my terror, but now it was also my constant companion, a reminder of the depth of human malice and the enduring strength of human spirit. As I write this final entry, the screen's glow casting long shadows across the room, I understand that true safety might never come. The network, the watchers, might always be out there, but so too would be the community I had helped build, the voices I had amplified, and the awareness I had spread. In the battle between light and darkness, I had chosen my side, and I would stand vigilant, a beacon in the night, ready to face whatever came next.